You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Shalom everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I hope you've enjoyed the previous recordings. And this week we are in the Haftarah of Parashat Acharey Mot. And Acharey Mot is the parasha that deals with the story of Yom Kippurim. What's the service of Yom Kippurim after the death of Nadav and Avihu, the sons of Aharon. And this week, again, depending also on the year, it depends if we're doing a leap year or not. So there are different dates that this recording can come out on. But one of the most important things to be pointed out here is that there actually are two possibilities of a reading. And because Acharey Mot and Kedoshim in a non-leap year are read together, usually that you read from, for example, from Ezekiel and so on. But because we're reading Acharey Mot by itself, what we actually have here is the possibility of reading either from Yechezkel or Ezekiel 22 or from Amos 9. Now, I'm going to go with Amos 9, first of all, because I really like the book of Amos. It's just a reality regarding myself. And the other side of it is that we actually have the possibility of reading Ezekiel or Yechezkel next week, the next recording for Kedoshim. So I'm going to go with Amos, but I'm also going to do something a little different. Amos is only a few verses long, literally like 10 verses, and that's it. And I actually want to talk about the entire chapter. So we're going to do something a little bit unusual for our recordings. I'm going to study the entire chapter out, and hopefully, add more information than usual, because it's a very, very short reading. And I don't want to spend too much time also in introduction to Amos, because that would be something that I'll probably do separately eventually in some series that I've been thinking of doing on Amos in overall. It's been on my mind for over a year now, but I decided to first of all do the recordings for the Haftarah, and then we'll probably do Amos. Amos has a lot of background, there's a lot of history there inside Amos, and there's a lot of other really interesting things that we can throw in, so I'm going to keep the introduction to that. But I'm going to say the following. Amos is a prophet about morality. He deals a lot with the question of moral behavior. And he points out, Amos says something that's very, very shocking. He says, you're not really different than the rest of the nations. This is really the part of the message of chapter 9. You're not really different than the rest of the nations. What makes you Israel is the fact that you've entered a covenant. You can't just call yourself Israel and say, okay, that's it. No. There's this discussion, this ongoing discussion, that if you are inherently a descendant of Israel, does it automatically make you something special? Or being a descendant of Israel is only an entrance into being something special? And Amos is of the opinion that your genealogy is not what factors into being who you are now. Your father might have been a great man, but you, if you're not like your father, very similar, by the way, to Ezekiel 18, if you're not like your fathers, then you can't walk around saying, oh, I'm a descendant of Israel, and that's it. There's a certain element that has to come with it together, which is loyalty to the covenant. So what we actually have here is a teaching or a prophecy that Amos presents that deals a lot with this question. I was actually looking into certain elements of differences in some thoughts that we find in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, in the Tanakh, and there were interesting questions in regards, for example, if a person's an Israelite and they misbehave, is their holiness taken away from them? Or can a person correct such a situation and bring their holiness back? And it looks like as if Yechezkel, for example, goes in that direction and says, yes, if you repent, then your wickedness is taken away and you return to the state of being Israel. But what happens if a person is still in the state of sin? Are they completely removed from being Israel? And that's a really interesting question, because that question shows up again in rabbinic sources, where we find a very, very famous statement that says, Yisrael shechata af al pi shechata Yisrael hu. An Israelite, and you have to understand the term used in rabbinic sources is usually Israel. The term Yehudi is used a little bit later, but it's something really that the Romans invented. Jews never really called themselves Jews until a certain point. But the idea there is that an Israelite, doesn't matter where he is, doesn't matter what his status is, doesn't matter if he knows he's an Israelite, he doesn't know he's an Israelite, and so on, he is still Israel. He still maintains that special, unique element that makes him into Israel. But then we also have a certain comment that we have in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, and versus the book of Chronicles a little bit. And I actually just finished writing a study, so as everyone knows, I pre-record these, so I'm actually talking about something that would probably happen over a month ago by the time you hear this recording. I finished doing a study on the attitude of the book of Chronicles towards the northern tribes and the remnants of the northern tribes during the times of King Hezekiah, but as reflected in the book of Chronicles, 2 Chronicles chapter 30. And there's a really interesting thing there. For example, Kogan wrote a very interesting article, not very long, but in Hebrew. I don't think it was ever translated. But he basically tries to understand, do we see different attitudes? And he says the book of Kings has this one attitude, but one of the most important contrasts there is actually Ezra and Nehemiah versus the book of Chronicles. So Ezra and Nehemiah were part of what's known as the Holy Seed movement. And what that meant was that they only accepted people that they could identify 100% as being Israelite, and also that they were submissive to the principle of Jerusalem, that you had to be part of the Jerusalem concept. You didn't have to live in Jerusalem, but you had to be part of the Jerusalem concept. And therefore, anyone who wasn't identified with that structure, where they could identify them being as Israelites from their perspective of what an Israelite is, you basically would be rejected. By the way, this is very, very similar to some of the debates that we have today inside Rabbinic Judaism. What exactly is a Jew? How do you identify a Jew? And so on. And on the other hand, Chronicles takes a different stance on this. And Chronicles seems to go in the direction of, as long as this person is loyal to the God of Israel, depends. There's this researcher called Ben Tzvi who argues that Chronicles actually goes in the direction that you still have to be loyal to Jerusalem and to the house of David, but doesn't matter where you come from, you're going to be considered an Israelite. Sarah Yefet, who's very famous for her work in the book of Chronicles, actually goes a little bit different than that. She says that the attitude is more accepting and that's it, doesn't matter who you are. But Ben Tzvi really did give a bit of a more sharper approach there, a much more sharper understanding of what's actually being said. And I actually, in my paper, I cited with him, you do see that element, but what's more important here is that Chronicles actually says, it doesn't matter who you are. You can be a descendant of the northern tribes, you can be a complete convert, you can be a ger. Convert is not a good word for our discussion here because it carries a different meaning nowadays. But Chronicles goes in the direction of, the door's open, anyone who wants to enter can enter. And what's very interesting, these same arguments exist to this very day. There are people like me who take the Chronicles approach, where doors open, anyone who wants to be Israel, you're welcome. And there's much more stern, much more severe, I would say more strict approaches inside Orthodoxy that says, no, only if you are inside this, that, and so on. So it's a really, really interesting thing, and we're actually seeing a debate here. The problem is that when you say stuff like this, especially if you come from a place of faith, you want to see the certain parts of the Bible to always agree with one another. But unfortunately, in this specific case, I think it's actually very, very blunt. This is something that I've been studying, I think, since my bachelor's. This is something I've been looking at since my bachelor's several years ago, when I was studying the Persian era, studying the Book of Chronicles, and it was in Ezra and Nehemiah specifically as well. And it was it's a very, very prominent thing. But what's also very important about this is the realization that there were parts of people who lived in Samaria that were descendants of Israel, but were rejected from being Israel. And the importance of this to today is that we actually do know that there are loads of people out there which are descendants of Israel. Doesn't matter from what line. Okay, it doesn't matter how the line exactly works. Like, for example, there are many Hispanics who are 100% descendants of Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity in Spain. There are probably people who think that they're Arabs who live inside Israel who are probably descendants of Israelites. There are probably people who live in Muslim countries, like in Iraq and in Afghanistan and all these different places that may be descendants of Israel as well. There could have been people who migrated down to Africa, and we just don't know. We don't know. There are groups that try to identify, but that also has a bit of a background. There are also groups that we can trace that the reason they identify as being Israel is because of something that happened with internal struggles of Christian groups and so on inside these different African countries. But there's most definitely Jews who migrated down south and migrated into Africa from Egypt. There's no doubt about it. I did a research on Ethiopia, and there's no doubt that there were Jews who were migrating from Egypt downwards towards the Horn of Africa, and they probably got mixed in with those groups. And there are probably people who walk around who are living in Africa who are descendants of Israel to this very day. But, and this is a really important thing, because if we only work based on a very specific way of looking what an Israelite is or what a Jew is, and we don't open up the discussion a little bit more, at least give an opening for those who have been lost, then we're only going to allow the opinion of Ezra and Nehemiah of the Holy Seed. And I have to point out that the Holy Seed movement didn't really win, because the majority of people said, look, these are our brothers and sisters. We have to accept them. And to this very day, most religious people, as far as I know, depending where, but a lot of religious people are much more open to accepting, but it depends where. Like here in Israel, there's a much more strict approach because of the fact that there's the rabbinate really controls everything here. And there's a lot to say about the rabbinate as well. Nothing personal, but there's some stuff there. So going back to Amos makes the point that the fact that you're an Israelite, the fact that you can trace your genealogy to Israel, is not enough. You also have to behave like an Israelite. If you don't behave like an Israelite, then you're on the wrong side of things. And that's a really, really important thing. Being loyal to the covenant. That's actually been a theme in a lot of the recordings I've done throughout this series, where I talk about the concept of being loyal. And that's part of what's going on here. Part of the discussion is being loyal. So Amos is a lot about doing the right thing, but from the perspective of doing the right thing as a moral person as well. He talks about cult, what's referred to as cult. Cult means, sometimes when I use these terms, sometimes people don't really understand what I mean. Cult means temple service. He talks about the costs of Shomron and Dan. He talks about different things as well, but there's a very strong element throughout the prophecies that have to do with moral behavior. Now, what's very interesting is that chapter 9 is actually a fifth vision. So Amos has several visions, and the fifth vision is a vision that has to do with God passing judgment. But what's very interesting is that he's passing judgment inside a temple. Now, a God inside a temple is nothing surprising, nothing that's supposed to surprise us. But what's very interesting is that we see several prophets who talk about seeing God in the temple. So we have Isaiah, we have Amos, we have Yechezkel, which is very, very temple-oriented. And the question is, which temple is he really talking about here? Because Amos is obviously a Judean. He's from Tekoa. I used to live not too far away from the Arab Tekoa. And it's actually in the Judean desert. I lived in the Judean desert for about a year. And so he was obviously a Judean, but he went up north to prophesy to the northern kingdom. And the problem that we have here is that I'm not 100% sure which one of the temples he's talking about. Because we also know that he prophesied to the north. That's really what he was doing. And it's quite possible that he's talking about one of the temples of Jeroboam. There actually recently, in the last couple of months, there have been discoveries in the area of what they presume is Bet-El, and there's always been attempts to discover where this Bet-El is, and people went to Bitin, which is one of the Arab villages there, and so on. It's very obvious that the Arabs preserved the old names of the area, but we don't know if this is necessarily really it. And now there's an archaeologist who thinks that he's actually discovered the cultic site, because he found shards, large deposits of broken pottery, and the practice was that when you broke pottery, when you cooked the sacrifice in a jar, usually what you would do, they didn't have a lot of metalware, so you would make pots out of clay. And the thing is that clay is porous, so it basically absorbs anything from what you're cooking in it, and therefore, if you have a sacrifice, and the sacrifice has to be consumed inside a certain amount of time, anything that the pot absorbs is part of the sacrifice as well, and therefore you break the pot so no one reuses it, and then they bury it. And this reality was actually discovered in the area of Shiloh as well. I have a friend who used to work in the archaeologies there, and also as a tour guide for the site, even though I don't know if he's still doing it. I haven't spoken with him in a while. But he told me back in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, that they discovered that what's very interesting is from any vantage point that you can actually see the site of what they think the tabernacle is. They found deposits, and again, I'm only repeating what I heard from my friend. And the moment you don't see the site anymore, the deposits drop. So it's very clear that the practice existed, and apparently, based on the same principle, this archaeologist discovered that there's a similar pattern in another area in the vicinity of what they think where Bet El was. So he's supposed to publish an official paper on this. He came out about 2 months ago, 2.5 months ago. He came out with a general proclamation that he thinks that he found the cultic site of Bet El, the temple site of Bet El, and now he has to. There's a congress that they do once a year of archaeology. This is one out of several that exist. For example, there's one for the Dead Sea Scrolls coming up in May at the Haifa University, which I have to attend as well. And so if you're in Israel, by the way, just an invite. Actually, not too sure when this recording actually comes out. I might miss it. But on the 5th of May, there's a conference, Haifa University, in the afternoon. A very important conference on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some really, really important people are going to be there. And though I'm not that important, I'm also going to be there because I have to. It's part of my training as a Bible scholar. And so we have conferences like this all the time. There's a conference on the book of Jeremiah later on, I think 20th of May or something like that. These all fall on Mondays, if I'm not mistaken. And he's going to be publishing, going back to the man who was excavating Bethel, he's going to be publishing more information about this. So the issue that we have here is the chapter starts like this. Ra'iti et Adonai, and by the way, Adonai is written here with Aleph Dalet Nun Yud, which is very interesting. Isaiah does the exact same thing. He doesn't say Ra'iti et Yud Hei Vav, Ra'iti et Adonai. Yechezkel does the same thing as well. Ra'iti Dmut Adam, I saw the image of a man. And he kind of describes the man, which is very important because what it actually shows us is that they're not really seeing God himself. He's actually describing an image that he sees. So it says, Ra'iti et Adonai, nitzav ala mizbeach. I saw Adonai standing upon the altar. We don't know which altar this is. But there's a good possibility here that we're talking about the altar of Bet El. And this is, by the way, how some commentators see it. Vayomer, and he makes a proclamation, this is a prophecy. Hacha kaftor ve'rashu hasipim. So he says, strike the kaftor. The kaftor is usually identified, this is also what's known as a collective. So strike the pillar crowns, the pillar heads. So you have a pillar. On the top of the pillar, you have like some kind of stone that has a decoration on it. So strike those. Ve'rashu hasipim, and the columns will shake. Uvetza'am berosh kulam. And he says here, uvetza'am means here that they cut, that they basically break, they crack. Because batza, livtzoa, is to slice something. And it's usually taken from the terminology of weaving. So there's batza, and there's also in Mishneh where it becomes patza. Ha'orek shnechutim, ha'potzea shnechutim, or botzea, bet and pei kind of interchange. And I actually have an article that deals a little bit with this subject, an article that hopefully will come out sometime soon. And ובצעם בראש כולם, and they all crack on the top of them, וחריתם בחרב וארוג. But now really what he's talking about is, now we understand the metaphor, is actually talking about the people. And anything which is left of them, the heads or the beginning will be cracked open, and their end, whatever is left of them, I will kill by the sword. Lo yanus lahem nas velo yimalet lahem palit. No one will be able to flee. There will be no fleers, and there will be no one escaping. So, imalet palit, he's playing a little bit with the words here. It says, Im yachteru vish'ol, misham yadi tikahem. If they dig down into Sheol, down into the ground, from there my hand, which means my actions, the ones, my extension, meaning the ones I send against them, my hand will take them. And if they go up to the heavens, from there I will take them down. By the way, that strongly reminds me of Ovadia, where he says, Sim basela kinecha misham oridecha. Ovadia says, it says to Edom, you can put your nest up in the mountains, I will still take you down from there. It says, V'michavu berosh HaKarmel. If they hide at the head of Mount Carmel. Now, what's important about head of Mount Carmel? First of all, for those who know, and for those who don't know, I live 20-minute drive away from Mount Carmel. I grew up in the area. I've actually surveyed the area many, many times as a teenager, as a kid and a teenager. And Mount Carmel, there's two very important things to know about Mount Carmel. What does it mean to hide at top of Mount Carmel? First of all, Mount Carmel is a very, very long mountain. It's first of all, by international standards, not really a mountain. It's a very, very large hill. Start with that. But it really is a mountain in ancient standard. But then it's a very, very long mountain. And this is the thing here in Israel. Most of the mountains that we have here in Israel are long ranges of mountains. So we have a long range of mountains starting from the Bay of Haifa, and it goes all the way down towards Dor, almost to, I would say, halfway to Atlit or something like that. And he says, even if you go up to the top of Mount Carmel and hide there, from there, Mishama Chapesud Kachtim. From there I will seek them and I will take them. This is verse 3. But what's the real point here? There's two things. Mount Carmel, first of all, is a mountain that has a lot of forest. So it's very easy to go in there and just hide, which I've done many times. But also, it has a lot of caves. Mount Carmel has some very, very prehistoric caves. Some of them were discovered to have people who dwelt in those caves, which means that it's a mountain that has places you can actually crawl into and hide as well. So he's not just talking about walking up Mount Carmel. He's talking about walking up Mount Carmel and also using the cavities which exist there to hide. So if they go up there, I'll find them. It says, Notice the motive of the up and the down. So previous verse, they go down and then up. Now they go up and they go down. If they hide from before my eyes at the bottom of the ocean, Hayam, which by the way, Mount Carmel is Hahar Asher Bayam, because if you look at the map of Israel, there's like this section that sticks into the ocean where Mount Carmel is. So he's really continuing from the same geographical vantage point that if you're not on the mountain, they can go down to the ocean as well. So if they go down to hide at the bottom of the ocean, from there will command the snake and he'll bite them. By the way, there are no snakes in the Mediterranean. However, the Nachash here is probably a symbolic creature that can hurt, but there's also sometimes Nachash is also used to describe like sea beasts and so on. So Amos has a little bit of, I would say, mythological creatures mentioned here, just a tad. It says, V'imilchu, this is verse 4, V'imilchu v'shevi lifnei oivehem, and if they go in captivity before their enemies, Misham atzavet acherev leharagtam. From there I will command the sword and it will kill them. V'samti eini alehem lera'ah v'lo letova. I'll place my eye upon them for evil and not for good. Basically, that they're going to be punished. And he says, now here, this seems to be more probably the words of Amos himself, because you have to remember there are places where the prophet speaks in the name of God, and sometimes the prophet speaks from his own voice. So he says, Va'adonai Elohim hatzevaot. So first of all, there's one abnormality here, hatzevaot. Usually it's Adonai Tzevaot, Yud Hei Vav Hei Tzevaot, HaTzevaot. There's a grammatical abnormality. It says, but Adonai Yud Hei Vav Hei of hosts, Hanogea Ba'aretz Vatamog, who touches the earth and it melts. This is a little bit of a Mount Sinai type of imagery. Might be a result of the idea of mentioning Mount Carmel. Ve'avlu kol yoshveva, and all who dwell upon it are mourning. They're basically in a state of suffering. Ve'alta chayeor kula, ve'shaka'a ki'or Mitzrayim. And it will go rise up. This again probably relates to the idea of mentioning the sea. The earth will rise up like the Nile, like the Yeol. It's an Egyptian name for the Nile. Iyur or something like that, or Uwer. It has to do with the idea of the Nile. It will go rise up and create a massive flood. V'shaka ki'or Mitzrayim, and then it will sink down, scooping everything with it, like the river of Egypt. So this is another name for the Nile. It says Haboneh v'shamayim ma'alotav, who builds in the heavens his stairs. So or ma'alotav might also mean his upper chambers. Basically his temple and the upper chambers of the temple. Va'agudato al eretz yesadah, and the looks like the foundation, maybe some kind of binding together or rocks. Some people think maybe it has to do with like maybe an arch that has rocks, that has the rock in the middle that keeps everything together. Because an agudah is to bundle something together. So its foundations or its bundle, he has founded on the earth. Hakoreh lemei hayam veishpechem al pnei haaretz, who summons the waters of the ocean and pours them upon the earth. Yud Hei Vav Hei Shemo, Adonai Shemo, the Lord is his name. So this is a bit of an interesting thing because it gets inserted here in no real relation to the previous part. This seems to be some kind of an exaltation, a proclamation of exaltation that the prophet just opens up and says when he hears the prophecy, when he hears what God is planning on doing. He says, "Look, Lord, you are great. The heavens and the earth are under your control." At least to me, it seems that this is what's going on. And then we actually get to the part which starts the Haftarah. So it says, "Haloch ivnei chushim atem li bnei Yisrael num Adonai." It says, "For you are like the sons of Cush." So there was a big row several years ago over the usage of the word Cushi. And the word Cushi in biblical Hebrew just means someone who's a Cushite, someone who comes from Cush, the area of Ethiopia, Somalia, Horn of Africa, Nubia, and so on. But like many words throughout history, when we reach modern times, they get altered a little bit in their meaning, and some people use them as derogative. So that, for example, certain words today that people don't use because now they feel that they're a derogative. So there was a big row because someone used the word Kushi to describe someone, but they never really meant it to indicate that the person's black, that in a derogative way. They just said, this is the Hebrew word for this, because shachol, this is not shachol. Shachol means, in Hebrew, just means completely black, and that's not the point. The usage of the word Kushi has to do with a person who actually comes from Africa. So in the Hebrew vernacular, before people actually use the word Africa, today it's standard. But prior to that, also because when you use the term Africa, you're not really talking just about people who are black, you're also talking about people who live in North Africa, which are actually Semites, many of them, some of them even descendants of the Phoenicians. And you also have people from South Africa, whites who live in South Africa, there are people who live in Zambia and Zimbabwe and all these, which are also white. So it's not really that simple to use that term. So the word Kushi really means someone which we identify as belonging to the black population that lives in Africa. But unfortunately, this word has lost its original meaning, and today when you use it, people feel offended when you use it. So I have to explain that in biblical Hebrew, this has no offensive meaning. I have to point out, by the way, that, for example, in France, using the word Jew is a derogative as well. But we don't really take offense to it because we don't care, because Jew, okay, big whoop. It's not the same way that if a person uses the word Kushi, if they're using it in an innocent way, they just mean someone who's African, someone who's black. So you have to be very careful sometimes not to be offended by an innocent word. It's very important today, especially now a day and age where everyone gets offended by everything. It's important to put things in perspective. So he says to them, you're like the sons of Cush, to me, the children of Israel. He's saying, look, you're like a group of people that I have no association with. Because, for example, if you take the Levant and Mesopotamia, it's still the same ethnic group. But he says, you are like the Africans to me, says the Lord. Halo et Yisrael eleti me'eretz Mitzrayim. For it is, and this is a really, really astonishing verse, for I brought Israel out of Egypt, from the land of Egypt, uflishtiim mikaftor ve'aram mikir. It says, I brought Israel out of Egypt, I brought the Philistines from Kaftor, and I brought the Arameans from Kir. So, Philistines from Kaftor we know, because Kaftor is one of the islands that has to do with the islands, the large islands of Greece. But Aram Mikir is a really interesting one, because we actually don't really know exactly where the Arameans come from, and this might be the only insight that we have to the origins of the Arameans. At least that's from what I know. So we don't really know exactly where Kir is, but it's somewhere probably in the east. And the assumption is that the Arameans came from somewhere in like northern Iraq, something like that. We don't really know for sure. Again, I'm guessing here mostly. But they came from there. But what's really important here is that he says, look, I brought this people from that place, this people from this place, those people from that place. More or less, and by the way, historically, this all happened more or less at the same time. The Exodus happened somewhere in the vicinity of several, either depends who you are, decades or centuries of the vanishing of the empires. Basically, Egypt retracted to itself, Assyria fell, Chati fell, Mitanni kind of still was there, but not exactly, and it opened up the area of the Levant for different groups to appear, which are Arameans, Philistines, Moabite, Ammonites, and especially Israelites. So this is historically accurate. Amos is aware of the history of the region hundreds of years before he lived. They were very aware of this, but what God is saying is, well, I brought this nation here, this nation, that nation. What's the difference? What's the difference? Well, the difference is as follows. Behold, the eyes of the Lord God, or the Lord Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, at the sinful kingdom, and I will destroy it from the face of the earth. He says, look, sin is a factor in how I treat peoples. You, Israel, are special to me, but the moment you do not keep the covenant with me, you are no different than other nations as well. You're like the Africans, you're like the Arameans, you're like the Philistines, you're like the Ammonites, the Moabites, everyone. You're no different. You're part of this entire complex collection of nations. But if you keep my Torah, you keep the covenant, then you become special. So he says, Ephes kilo hashmed ashmi et bet Yaakov neum Adonai. However, Ephes is a special type of negation. In modern Hebrew it means zero. It really means, however, in a negative sense, for I will not surely destroy the house of Jacob, the word of the Lord. Why? Because he still has a covenant with Israel, and he's loyal to the covenant. He says, look, I am loyal to my covenant too. This is why I'm only going to punish you, but never destroy you. But you on your end are not loyal to the covenant. But you can't really destroy God. That's actually something, I wrote a research about loyalty treaties in the ancient world. I actually submitted it just a few days ago. And one of the things that I point out there is that there's actually, even though there are similarities, there are also massive differences. Because, for example, God is not, say, some king from some kingdom that you can rebel against. Because God is God. There are some differences there. Some major ones. So he says, Ki hinei anochi metzaveh, for behold I command, v'hani'oti b'chol hagoyim et bet Yisrael, I will shake Israel in all the nations. Israel is going to be scattered everywhere. Kasher yanoa b'kavara v'lo yipol tzeror aretz, as something moves inside the kavara. Kavara is, it's a little difficult to explain some of this terminology because it's not something we use in everyday life, but a kavara this is a very unusual word for the Hebrew Bible. This is the only time it appears. The next time we hear this word is in Mishneh Hebrew, and a kavara is usually some kind of a sieve of some sort. So he's putting them through the sieve. Velo yipol tzror aretz. So a tzror is usually like a rock or some kind of mud that gets mixed into the grains in the flour. And now you're sieving through it. You're basically saying, look, I'm sieving them through to clean out the garbage, to clean out the dirt from Israel. So to the earth, which means the area where they're collecting the clean flour, none of the bad material is going to fall in there. And he says, "B'cherev yamutu kol chatayei ami." By the sword, all the sinful ones of my people will die. Ha'omrim lo tagish v'tagdim ba'adenu ha'ra'a, who say, it will not draw near and precede us the evil. Now, this is a really important statement because this has to do with a certain mentality that people had then. People sometimes have. God is with us. That's it. God is with us. Jeremiah says, Echad Adonai, Echad Adonai, Echad Adonai Hema. They say the house of the Lord, the house of the Lord, the house of the Lord. They say there was this notion that they're saying we're protected because we have a temple. This is why it was very important to actually start from the temple, from the beginning of the chapter, not from here, because we lose a context. And the context is temple. They think they're protected by the temple because they're serving God there. Because in the eyes of the northern kingdom, they were serving the God of Israel in that temple. And he says, no, that temple doesn't protect you. There's an interesting link here. Jeremiah is aware of Amos, and they're talking about the same thing. Amos stands from the perspective, Amos and Yirmiyahu stand from the perspective of you are not protected by these magical items that you call temples and ark and so on. You are only protected if you're loyal to the covenant, because God can take away all these things and you're completely exposed. You cannot appease him anymore either. So the issue here is being loyal to the covenant, and those who are sinful of the nation will be removed. But because God loves his people, and we find this in Yirmiyahu 2, he starts off and he says, I haven't abandoned Israel. Even though Yirmiyahu is full of wrathful prophecies and he sees with his own eyes the destruction of the temple and destruction of Jerusalem, he still more or less starts his prophecy with positive things. Same thing Isaiah. Isaiah sees the trouble of Jerusalem and he says, even though Judea is destroyed and even though there's a threat on Jerusalem, eventually the mountain of the Lord will be exalted above all mountains. The prophets always have inside their prophecies, either the beginning or the end. Yechezkel with his description of the temple from chapter 40 onwards, they're always these prophets who see doom and destruction, also see hope in the future. And this is the thing as well, always have hope. When I was talking a lot about Isaiah, I pointed out hope. Hope is a big, big part of his prophecies. And this is what we have here. And he says, Bayom Mahu. This is really a prophecy to all of Israel. And that day, Akim et Sukkot David hanofelet. I will erect the tabernacle, which actually not should be tabernacle, it's Sukkah. It's the house with just a roof of leaves. It's Sukkot David hanofelet. I will rebuild the fallen Sukkah of the house of David. V'gadarti et pirtzehen, and I will gader is a fence, but I will fence off the breaches. V'arisotav akim, and its ruins I will erect. Uvniti akimei olam, and I will build it like the days of old. But also means I will build it for an eternal time. But now he says something that's a little bit unusual. He says, Leman yirshu et sherit Edom, for in order that they inherit the remnants of Edom, v'chol hagoyim asher nikra shemi aleim, and all the nations which my name is upon them, Ne'um Adonai osezot, the word of the Lord who does this. Now this is a really interesting thing. So, Edom here still can be understandable because the Edomites were trying to invade into Judea, and they were chipping away from the kingdom of Judea. But what is all the nations which my name is upon them? So some people say that this has to do with the fact that King David governed over several nations like Moab and Ammon and some of the Arameans and so on. So this is bringing the house of David back to its former glory and former strength of ruling the region in general. But then the end of the prophecy here has a very agricultural context, which I think is probably one of the most beautiful sections in the entire Tanakh. Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu also has very similar imagery as well, because we have to understand that the covenant is connected to the land. And when the land gives its fruit, then we know the covenant is working. That's what we see in Deuteronomy many, many times. It says, Hinei yamim ba'im neum Adonai. Behold, the days come, the word of the Lord. V'nigash choresh bakotzer. A plower will come near to the one who harvests. Everything's going to happen such rapid in quantities that they're going to plow while they're harvesting because everything's going to be so abundant. V'dorech hanavim b'moshe chazara. And the one who steps on the grapes, which is the end of the harvest. Usually the wine and everything is at the end of the harvest, more or less. B'moshe chazara, by the one who pulls, basically the one who sows the earth. Ve'itifu he'arim asis, the mountains will drip asis. Asis is usually a very young type of wine. Ve'chol ha'gevaot titmogagna, and all the hills will melt away because there's so much of oil and wine and everything's so healthy. It says V'shavti, and this is such a wonderful verse. V'shavti shvut ami Yisrael, I will return the captivity of my people Israel. Uvanu arim nashamot ve'yashav, they'll build desolate cities and dwell in them. V'nat'u cheramim v'shatu et yenam, and they will plant vineyards and they will drink its wine. V'asu ganot v'achru et pirem, they will make gardens, small orchards, and they will eat their fruits. And then he uses the metaphor of trees towards people. V'nta'atim al admatam, I will plant them upon their land. And they will not be removed, pulled away from the earth, from the land which I have given them. Amar Adonai Elohecha, says the Lord your God. Probably one of the most beautiful imageries ever, because if you're a person who lives in agriculture, not a silly dweller, if you're a person who lives in agriculture, and I grew up, I still live to this very day. I live in the same town now that I grew up in, even though I wasn't here for a very long time. But I lived in Jerusalem for a very long time as well, and I lived in rural parts of Israel too. And the area I live in has beautiful soil, beautiful black soil. And we have large, at least for Israel, large areas where you can see people planting different plants. And I remember when I was growing up, driving from the Haifa area into my town, and you could see the fields on both sides, the beautiful earth, and my friends used to have small orchards, like for example, a little garden that they had in their house, and they would have these beautiful fruits and everything. And you see these things, and you see how amazing when you go to the supermarket and you buy a piece of fruit. It's not the same when you walk up to the tree and you see it, you smell the tree and everything. So if you live an agricultural life, if you live in a world where you get to see where food comes from, these are very, very powerful words. When I was a child, we used to be taken to the Carmel, what used to be called Carmel Mizrahi back then, but now it's called Carmel. It's a wine factory, but they also produce grape juice and so on. Assis, even though Assis is not really that, but I'm going to call it Assis for now. And seeing how the vineyards that they have in the area, and seeing the process of picking and taking and producing and walking through the rooms with the barrels and everything, or the fact that we used to be taken to do olive pressing. We used to be taken to, there'd be a lot of olive presses in the area. There was an olive press found just behind where I live, literally the block we live in, and there's another block behind us. Before they built the apartment building there, they dug in, they found in the entire area loads and loads of olive presses. And as children, we were actually shown what olive presses looked like in the biblical times, and we pressed oil by ourselves. We did old-style oil pressing, and it was an amazing rig to stand on. You have to press and everything, just amazing things. So when you live this and you breathe this and you see this with your own eyes, these words become very, very powerful, because you can see how great the blessing of the land can be if we keep to the covenant of Torah. I hope you enjoyed this recording, and I apologize for all the noise in the background. Nothing I can do about that. But I hope you enjoyed this recording, and if you do feel that these recordings have blessed you, please consider to contribute so I can get study material, papers. Sometimes I have to be able to photocopy from places and so on to be able to study the material. But more importantly, share with your friends, share your thoughts, comment, and also share the recording itself wherever you can share it. Kol Tov.